record, and we're good. All right. See everybody. Awesome. So today we are going to be doing or learning about Sass. A little bit of Sass. Has anyone heard about Sass? It stands for Semantically Awesome Style Sheets. I know as you're doing research, you might have come across it. You might have seen some things and been like, what kind of crazy CSS is that? Just curious. All right, doesn't look like anyone. So what we're going to get introduced to is Sass. Now, Sass is kind of an advanced version of CSS. It's almost like, I would compare it to something like you learn JavaScript. And so you're like, all right, JavaScript's really cool. And then all of a sudden you're introduced to Angular. And then you're like, wow, so we take this JavaScript and we do it in this particular format. And it has these controllers and config files, all this kind of pre-built in functionality. And then you just get to apply your normal JavaScript to that. That is kind of what Sass is about. Sass is stands for Semantically Awesome Style Sheets, but it's a CSS preprocessor. And a preprocessor is going to process the CSS written in Sass. The extension is going to be SCSS. That's going to be the extension that we're going to be writing in. And it's going to take files written in that extension and transpile it into its normal CSS counterpart. So it's going to take all the things that it does in Sass and convert them into normal CSS, right? So maybe the question would be asked, why then would I be using Sass? I mean, if I can write it all in normal CSS. And the reason being is that you can do a lot with Sass. There's pre-built-in functions. There's things called mix-ins. There's a concept of nesting your CSS. So related CSS is kind of nested within one another, and you create this kind of tiered structure. You can create variables just like you would in normal JavaScript and then reference those variables. So it makes it easier to write CSS. And then you can then go do other stuff, normal CSS, and then just transpile it, and it converts it into normal CSS. Because our browsers only understand normal CSS. They don't or can't process Sass. And it's the same thing with when we go into the world of React, we write React using ES6. You know, not the latest version of JavaScript, because I think the latest version of JavaScript is like ES8, but ES6 was a huge jump from ES5 to ES6. There's a lot was introduced. And so in order for a normal machine to understand ES6 code, you have to transpile it back into ES5. And we use transpilers for that. Things like Babel. Babel converts ES6 into ES5. So Sass also is this pre-processor for us for Sass. Now it's a Ruby-based CSS processor, and we've been getting into Ruby, right? Matt Install helped everyone to get Ruby installed. We're going to start working with Ruby today, and then we'll pick up some Ruby tomorrow, and then we'll jump into Rails as of next week, Rails being the web platform. So now, using Sass, we're going to have to do a few things to get started. So I'm going to go into, I think I already have it open here. You're going to go into, let's see, morning exercises. I'm going to be in the instructor examples. I copied the starter code there. So I'm going to be there. You'll be in morning exercise in the starter code. So take a moment to get there. Go into that, pull that up, make sure in your terminal you're there. We're going to create some files and we have to start Sass from there. So get into code folder. Okay. Just click on the happy face when you're all there. Make sure we're all.
It's in Unit 3, right, Joe?
No, we're in Unit 4.
Well, no, we're in Unit 4, but the file is at Unit 3 because in Unit 4's it's listing week 10 stuff. So
Unit 4, I'm in DeVito, and we should see week 9, day 4.
Maybe I have to
get full upstream master.
I was just gonna say I might. That's probably what I have to do.
Yeah, you have to pull all of your files. If you don't see it on your side, but you see that I see it, and that just means you haven't pulled it.
Hey, which folder did you say we were in?
We are in Unit 4, week 9, day 4. And I also posted the link in our Slack channel. So if you click on that, it'll take you right into it as well. You're gonna be obviously a morning exercise in the
morning exercise. Okay,
yeah, that's what you're gonna be. I copied that folder over to morning exercise. I copied it over to instructor examples, new conflict. It happened one time where I was working in the morning exercise. I think Jemery had a merge conflict, so never again do we ever work in the same folder. Is there any chance that that's going to happen? So 9, 10, 11. Got 11. Get another folder. I'll kind of show you what we're going to be building also. I always like to do the, hey, this is the end product. Now we need to get there. This is where we started. This is where we're going to end. How are we going to get there? 16, 17. All right. I think almost everyone's there. Ultimately, this, while we're waiting for everyone else, I'll just kind of show this is where we're going to wind up. So this is the site. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. This will be the site that we'll be building. It's like an online food delivery site. We have obviously containers that have sub-containers. We can see that colors and fonts are being applied separately. We have some content down here. Zoom back in. And that's the ultimate goal. That's what we're going to be building. But what we have is just this. This is kind of where we're going to start with. All this, no real styling being applied as of yet. So we need to get our way, add all of our Sass code, transpile that, and then we'll have something like this. And ultimately, once we do have our Sass, like if I went to DevTools here just to look at the files that are being pulled, I'll see, hey, it's a main CSS, cool. If I go to main CSS, I'm gonna see a lot of CSS that perhaps I wouldn't normally write. Like, I don't write like this very often. That's not CSS, that's targeting specific properties in CSS, but that's not a way that I usually write with all these types. It seems like, not that there's redundancy there, but there just seems like a lot of added code in ways that I wouldn't necessarily have written. I might have done just type or input, because I know that this is like a checkbox, so maybe I would have just targeted that particular input itself. But there's a lot of additional code, and we won't be writing, stuff like this. We're going to write, once again, kind of normal or semi-normal CSS constructed in Sass, and then it's going to transpile it. Okay? So, when you look through CSS, when you go to someone's site and you're like, oh, that's really cool, I want to take a look at it, and you see all of this really intense, fine-grained CSS, know that could be that they're using preprocessors in order to do that. And a lot of the times when I'm looking through CodePens, looking at stuff, and you can always, if you really pursue this, you can just go to CodePens and look at CSS or SAS-related projects, and you can see how amazing the tool can be. Sweet. All right, looks like everyone's good, so we are going to get started. Now, in order to use SAS, we need to install SAS. Doesn't come pre-built with our machines. So we learned about gems. I think we're installing gems when Matt was doing it. You install Rails, and Rails was a gem. And gems are part of Ruby. They're comparable to, NPM or Yarn, which is another package manager that's competing with NPM for Node. And so we would do something like gem install SAS, okay? To install SAS. Now, I've already installed it. I'm going to install it again and make sure we're all on the same versioning. Shouldn't take too long to install SAS. And once SAS is installed, I'm just going to take a look at the versioning. And then this doesn't always work. The Mac to Imager doesn't always work. There we go. All right. Just make sure you installed SAS. You get a version. There we go. Troll face. My version is 3.74, which I'm going to assume is going to be your version also. And Matt went over versioning yesterday as well. The difference between the major, minor, and then patches, and something that it doesn't yet have a patch. 3.7.0, maybe you want to avoid that until they come out with 3.7.1. So they fix errors anytime they come out with something. Anytime, guaranteed, there's going to be something that comes up. Something unexpected, no one saw it. Under this specific condition, does that happen? Okay, and then that's patches come, they come in enhancements, okay? So we should get a version. We get our version, 3.7, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18. Okay. And then we're going to get started with setting up our project folder for SAS, okay? Is it still installing for anyone? Because I only got 17, 18, 19. Once again, those numbers are important. I don't want to leave anyone behind while it's doing that. We're setting up, because then there'll be discrepancies. All right, cool. I'm going to do this. I'm going to just kind of squeeze this in. I don't need as much of that. Move this here. Clear out my screen. All right, so if I do an ls-l, I'll see that I'm in, right, that particular folder, instructor examples. Cool, asset CSS. Clear all that. So what we're going to do is we're going to touch CSS main. Now, this is important. .scss. That's important. Okay, we're creating a SCSS. Now, I'm going to go into, I'm going to open up, just to show you what happens when it gets created. All right. Just going to open it up in Atom. Did have it open it up in Atom. Right? All right. Here. So I'm in here. There is a final touches SCSS file that we're going to use later on as just kind of a final thing. But for right now, I don't really have anything else in here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and create it. Point. All right. Now I have an SCSS file, right? Doesn't look any different than CSS. Nothing really big happened there. Move this over. Get this back open. All right. Now what we're going to do is, this is where you're going to see something change. Okay, so make sure you have Atom open and you're in instructor examples. Okay, make sure that that's open. Obviously, your terminal's open because you did the install. What we're going to do is turn on Sass to watch, zoom in a little bit here, to watch our CSS folder, or file, I'm sorry, main.scss. And so it's going to watch the Sass file that we created. And a few things are going to be created here at this point in time when we do this. Okay? First off, what we're going to see is that we're in sort of like the terminal's kind of hung up, almost like we're in Mongo or something, and now we have to type Mongo commands. Or we're Node, we started up the Node server, and it's like logging things. We really can't type anything into the terminal at this point in time. We're in this kind of watching stage, okay? Or like when we installed Morgan, which was a logger at one point in time for Node. It did the same thing, right? It just added additional output. And so what you're going to see is some new files here. We're going to see this mean CSS map. And then it also creates a main CSS file. We didn't create that. We created SCSS, and yet it creates a CSS file as well. So what it does is it takes whatever main folder you have here and creates its CSS counterpart, okay? So just want to make sure everyone's there. Give me a thumbs up. Oh, that's the wrong one. Delete that. I always feel like my Mac to Imager is always behind. Oh. There we go. That should be the new one, right? Okay. Make sure that you see that it's monitoring your CSS, okay? Cool. Looks pretty easy, right? All right. So we have it open. It's created also a Sass cache folder as well. So there's a few things there, okay? The mapping as well. And I think what the mapping is going to do, it's going to use like references. We don't go into the map. We don't touch the map folder. All we're going to do is edit the SCSS file. It'll transpile it into main CSS. And that's really all we need to do. We don't need to do anything else. It's going to do it all. Okay? Awesome. Open up the index file, right? So copy full path, wherever you want to do it, and just plop it in here. I think that that's the one that I had open. And that's what we should see. We should see this, okay? It's big. It's over, okay? And then what we're going to do is we're going to go into our main CSS file, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, in our main SCSS file. We're not going to touch the main CSS file. When you're using Sass, what's really important is here, when you're using Sass, you don't go into main CSS to make edits. That's kind of like an untouchable file as of right now. Everything we do is in CSS, Sass, and Sass controls main CSS. Our conduit into main CSS is through main SCSS. Okay, so we're going to just get this started. I want to fix the image, so I'm going to say image, and we're going to say width, 100 pixels. Okay, I'm going to save it. Just going to go back, refresh the page, and we should see that it's been fixed. Okay, easy enough, right? That's not too hard. Let me get rid of this. Now, what I'm going to do is take a look at main CSS, and look, it's there. Main CSS, it's copied over what we've done in here and placed it here. Okay, that's what we should expect. Okay. Any changes we do make, we're going to see transpiled eventually into it. Now, what's really cool about Sass is that kind of just like Node, just like Rails too. I noticed yesterday when they were setting up Rails, several people might have errored out with Rails. And Rails kind of provided you some better examples than maybe Node did. Like Node provided you like, here's this crazy error. If you didn't know where the error was coming from, it was really hard to decipher. But say I do this. I'm going to open up this file. I'm going to keep this over here. Because once again, it's watching. It's watching any changes. If I go into my main SCSS and I make a mistake, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to give like 2 colons there. You can't write CSS like that. That'll break. I'm going to save it. I get an error here that states, you know, error main CSS line 2, invalid CSS after expected dot. Now, once again, it's not telling me specifically that it's a double colon, but it is telling me on line 2, and I could go to line 2 and then see that it's there, right? So knowing that that's the case, I want to see, did it write it to here? Look, my main CSS now has all of this, like all this stuff in here, which wasn't there before. I'm going to go to main CSS, and I'm going to SCSS. Let me keep confusing it. And I'm going to fix it, save it. Now go in here, and it got rid of all those errors. All of that messaging is now gone. Okay, so it really is this kind of vibrant tool where as you're using it, if you type something that's wrong, you're going to see it. I get a lot of this just with errors, you know, just teaching different classes and people submitting lots of homework, especially when I do the evening class, because everything is, you know, HTML and CSS. They'll submit problems and I'll say, hey, it's not working. And it's just somebody forgot a missing semicolon or 2 colons, or they forgot the X, and it breaks a bunch of different code. So a tool like this would have kind of indicated them immediately, hey, something's broken at that point in time, right? So we know that it works. Awesome. Now, so why are we using Sass? Like, what are some of the advantages of using Sass? One of the advantages is that we can create variables, right? Variables are going to allow us to reference these colors anywhere in our CSS as a single point of reference, just like variables work in JavaScript, just like they're going to work in Ruby and any other language. They allow us to define it up here, reference it anywhere else, and if we want to change that color across the scope for anything that's looking at it, we could easily go up here and do it. Now, when it comes to Sass, Sass has its own way of doing it. I just wanted to point out also, and you might have seen it, is that normal CSS or CSS3, we can also do something very similar to that. We're not going to implement this. I'm just kind of showing you it as a thing that CSS3 has, is that you can do something very similar to that where you can create a root, this colon root, and then set a color using the 2 dashes. This is the construct, and then reference that color later as var. Has anyone seen that? Anyone seen that at all?
Yeah, Jericho's done that quite a few times.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've seen Jericho do that. Okay, that's right. So this came around with CSS3, and once again, it's probably as something that's come out of Sass. You know, they see all this functionality from these advanced tools, and then they're like, hey, we should implement those, just like semantic HTML, which contains articles and sections. That came out of the need or watching people write divs that had a class of section and article. Then they just created those things. So here what we're going to do is we're going to add these variables and say, you know, SG gray colon Gainsborough. Okay. SG, you know what I'm going to do? Because I know I'm going to fat finger this, so I'm just going to copy this. I could write it all. Let me slack it out. Okay. Just select out the colors. We'll just make it easier.
Hey, Joe, are we putting that in the main CSS or the main
I'm sorry. Yeah, in the SCSS file. So I'm going to close my main CSS file so I don't go into it. Don't save it. There we go. I'm just going to kind of default back to what I'm used to doing, right? Going to main CSS and do it. Once you do that and you save it, if you go back here, we don't see anything. I did save it. But once again, I don't see anything in here as of yet. Okay. Now what we're going to do is apply one of those colors. So once again, in the main SCSS file, I'm going to say body. And let me see, can I do BGC? Yeah, BGC background color. And I'm going to apply the SG, and that's kind of short for Space Ghost, scripter that created it. Give it some naming conventions. And then the color of the text, I'll do SG black. Okay, I'm going to save it. Once I save it, I go back to Space Ghost. I should see the background color change. Now the text itself is kind of black already. So if I go here to black, Gainsborough is just, or black here, that's just a shade of black. It's not the darkest shade of black, but it is a shade of black. And we're referencing it. I'm going to take a look in main CSS and see what it has. All right, so it's converted it into those particular colors, right? I believe that's what maybe the map is being used for, to be honest. I think the map is kind of doing some sort of mapping between them. I don't edit the map. I don't play around with the map file, but I believe it's the thing that's kind of doing the mapping between. So that looks good, right? We've all done body to... Oh, just make sure, let me know you got that done. Applied the changes, you save them, you see them. Awesome. So as of right now, I suppose if we compared Sass to normal CSS, and being that CSS has these variables, there's no real difference at this point in time. It's just kind of like, all right, it just seems like more work, right? I got to have this watch thing. I mean, the value of the watch is that you can see errors immediately, right? So that is one solid benefit right now. And the variables, I don't know, I think the variables may be even more intuitive, like putting dash dash before something and then var here. I don't know. It doesn't seem natural. It seems unnatural in CSS, actually. You know, I almost think I'm in kind of JavaScript at that point in time. So, awesome. What we can do now, the other advantage to this is that we can create functions. Okay. So I only got 12 or 13? Okay. So make sure you get it done. I'll just kind of explain functions while everyone's kind of catching up here. Functions are a way, just like we use functions in JavaScript, and just like you'll use methods in Ruby. Ruby doesn't have functions, they have methods. And we know methods as functions attached to objects in JavaScript. Same principle. Here we have functions, things like lighten and darken. There's more functions. These aren't the two only functions. These are just kind of coloresque based functions. And what these functions are going to allow us to do is to darken or lighten particular shades of color based on a percentage. Think of how would we lighten or darken a color normally in CSS? Anyone know the property that we would use?
Not the opacity, right?
No, well, opacity does everything. Opacity applies, well, once again, opacity is changing the color of everything, and it's, you know, removing the color to hit 0 opacity, then you don't see it. What's the other way? If I had a background color and I wanted to like fade that color in and out, what option would I use for color, for colors?
Would it be alpha?
Okay, and what would that be? That would be, give me the whole name.
RGBA?
Yeah, RGBA, correct. That's what I'm saying. RGBA, alpha being the last one, right? So if we wanted to do something like that, like if don't do this, I'm just showing you RGBA, and then we give it a series of colors, you know, 155, 155, 155, and then we'd use this as maybe 0.5. That would be half the color, half the opacity of it, okay? So RGBA is how we would do it if we wanted to do opacities of colors, right? Because if we're using hex colors, we don't have that. So this is our kind of our only way, I suppose, in CSS to change the opacity besides doing opacity 0. So Sass gives us these functions that allow us to do it also, right? So what we're going to do is create a new class called featured. Okay, and in this feature, we're going to change some things in our design. And so let me see where feature is being applied. Let's see. If I take a look here, featured contains both of those elements. This, if I go here, developer tools, just to take a look, like where is feature being applied? Here is bflog, and this is featured. So featured contains both the bflog and it contains the cheese log. And we can see that they're both stacked on top of each other as normal block level elements would be, right? It's a normal block level element process. They're going to stack. Okay, so what we're going to do is go back into our CSS, and we're going to do display flex, okay? Now, if I save that and I just see what it does what flex would do. Like at this point in time, you should know flex would make things sit next to each other. Okay, I just wanted to show that. So now let's just do, let's add some more. Say, hey, a width of 98%, a margin of auto, right, which should center the thing. We're going to do justify content space around. Oh, no, I didn't do it. Space around. That's part of flex. And then background VGC. For background color, I'm going to use the darken method. I'm going to target or leverage the SG-gray. And I'm going to give it a 30%, I would say, alpha at this point in time, right? Oh. Just trying to save it. 30% alpha. I'm going to go back, take a look, and I can see now that it is a dark gray with this 30%. Obviously, if I get rid of the 30%, it's just going to be the dark gray. So we're going to leave it. Okay. So let me put that in here. Make sure you're caught up. Now, darken and lighten are also, methods used elsewhere. In D3, they also have D3 colors darken. If I was to take a look at just D3, I was just looking at it earlier here, like RGB.darken. So D3 has these methods also. And once again, the person who wrote D3 was exposed to Sass, knows everything about HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and decided to incorporate those methods into its own particular library. So you'll start to see some of these things across the board, as in like, oh, I know what darken means here. I've seen it elsewhere. So it doesn't come as a surprise. Maybe the way darken's written here, darken with the color and then the percentage, versus in D3, I could just say darken and give it a number. Like it knows what the color was because you passed the color, and then you just tell it to what point you want this thing to be dark. Excuse me. So this is one of the first real benefits now to Sass, right? Functions. Functions allow us to do this. The other benefit to Sass is the fact that we can nest. We can nest elements, CSS rules, inside of other CSS rules. Where have we seen that? Where have we seen some sort of nesting of CSS rules? You might have seen it. Does this look familiar? Like if I was to do display width, I don't know, 768 pixels, and do this, and then say div that, is that kind of nested in a way? Like, I mean, that's a media query, and the media query is kind of like an event listener, always listening. And so I encompass this media query, and I add as many rules as I want to it, right? Don't do this. I'm just showing you that this is an example of nesting that we would have seen as per responsive design, okay? So it's not new, the ability to nest in normal CSS, but Sass gives us another way of doing this as well. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to On line 7, I'm just going to create a new variable because we're going to use this content with 35%, right? So maybe single lines of things like we can type out. If it's a big bold of it, we'll copy and paste. But once I have this, I'm going to save it, right? Main CSS, nothing's changed. Hasn't added anything here. It's been added here, but it hasn't been referenced, so it's not visible in the CSS. Now, this is the advantage of using Sass. The second real major one would be to nest. So inside the feature rule, I can add a div here and say with featured content with. Oh, we did have it. I'm going to save it. If I go back here, these widths should change. These widths have changed. They've been applied. And I could go and inspect those elements and see that this beef log is now 35%. Whatever percent we put there, that is 35%. This cheese log is 35%. Okay. The other, if we wrote that in normal CSS, you don't, once again, don't do this. I'm just kind of showing you. It would be, you know, featured div, right? Have we seen the greater than sign here in CSS? Has anyone been working with that? Has Jerica demoed that at all? Just curious. You can jump off the mic if you've seen it. Have you seen it in other, like as you've been examining things? Anyone know what it stands for, doing this versus this?
Yes, Jerica has demonstrated it. It's basically the featured class, and then the direct child would be div.
Got it. Okay. And if I remove that, what does that mean?
That would essentially be any div within the featured class. It could be several layers down, but any div within featured.
Sweet. Awesome. So we're able to do that same structure, but target those elements in that same fashion, but do it like this, right? So perhaps we're removing the need to write longer CSS with using the greater than sign and just kind of structure them in this fashion, okay? Once again, another good advantage to writing it. Because I really, in all honesty, having to write these long-winded CSS takes time. When I do it like this, I just know that this thing is a direct child of that thing, okay? So the other advantage to doing this is extend and inherit. And by extend and inherit, what we can do is create a class, and in this instance, we'll be creating this class here, and we'll be inheriting that class or extending that class's CSS properties to another class. Now, there's nothing in the HTML that contains a featured content class. It hasn't been referenced. If I go into the HTML and I look or search for anything that has featured content, it doesn't exist. It's not there. By featured exists, but not featured content. There's featured, but featured exists here, but not featured content. So I want to make that clear, like it doesn't exist. And yet we can define it here and then use it later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that. So I'm just going to copy this. Paste it out, typing it all. And so I'm going to save it. If I go into CSS, I'll see it there. And so, you know, featured content, we're adding a border. We're using RGBA, using opacity. We're doing a box shadow, giving it a background color. This time we're using lighten, choosing gray, making it 50%. Text align center, padding 5 Ms. Does anyone explain what Ms stands for and what it's referencing here?
I think 1 M is like the normal size. So
Okay.
half an M would be.
Right, so what's the
half
normal
the
size? You're absolutely right. Like 1M is a percentage of something, but what is that?
Is it based on the font size?
So yeah, 1M is 16 pixels. 1M is 16 pixels. By default, it also depends because this, why would we use M? So how about that? How are M's useful? I'm just saying this while we're waiting for everyone to kind of catch up with adding the featured content.
Doesn't that, there's a set font size for the browser and it can change based on the screen size? So if you're referencing the M, it refers to that?
Sure. Yeah, you're onto something, Lauren. You're absolutely right. So M's reference a setting that has been defined on a immediate parent, and M's will be a percentage of the immediate parent. So if featured content, which in this instance, padding, there is no parent. The only parent would be sort of, I would say, the body. And we're defaulting to 16 pixels as 1M. M's reference the immediate parent. If the immediate parent's pixel size, or say we did font size, if the font size on the parent was 20 pixels and a child has a font size defined as 0.5 M's for its font size, then its font size will be 10 pixels, half of its immediate parent. So it looks up the chain. It keeps looking up the hierarchy of CSS to see if its immediate parent has defined that property, and then it will be a percentage of that, whatever you decide. 0.5 will be half of that. 1.5 will be 1.5 times of that. Okay. If it finds nothing, if there's no immediate parent, it just keeps going up, 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 up until it hits the body or HTML, and then it uses 16 pixels as its M. Okay, so because there's also the concept of, I don't know if we've covered this, also rems as well, like a rem versus an M. I won't go into the rem. Actually, well, rem always references HTML. It doesn't look at the immediate parent, always goes up to the HTML. M's always reference an immediate parent. And if the immediate parent doesn't have it, it just keeps going up until it finds something. Okay? And you will see this all the time. You will see M's everywhere. As you investigate websites, you're going to start to see more and more of M's. It's a responsive styling that I've been seeing around quite more often. So now that we have this, we have featured content. What we're going to do now is, once again, add that benefit. The other real benefit is using the extend and inherit to inherit property. So I'm going to say here beef log, and I am going to extend dot featured content. Okay, and what we're doing now is we're taking everything that's here. Once again, that class hasn't been assigned in HTML as of yet, but we're defining it, and we're going to inherit that or extend that functionality into beeflog. Okay, I just want to do that. Save it. If I go to main CSS, right, I do see here that it's constructed it like this, saying, oh, okay. I'm going to go back into main CSS, go in here, refresh, and we should see that featured log now, that beeflog has that construct, right? Even though, in all honesty, there is no featured content here, right? I see featured. I don't see any class for featured content. If I did look in my main CSS folder, I would be a little puzzled here to be like, but there is no featured content. How is this thing getting it? It just is. Sass is making it so that it gets it. So understand, now when you're starting to look through CSS and you're like, but this thing, oh no, here we go. See how it's comma? It added the comma. So the comma means both of these properties, both of these classes have the same properties. So extending it, this is how it creates the role. So you can assign the same properties to two specific elements by just using the comma. Without the comma, it would mean that beeflog was a child or a child element of featured content. Awesome. So we're going to do the same thing with the cheese log. I'm going to do dot cheese log. and extend, dot feature content, right? Feature content. Okay. Do that, refresh, make sure they both. Oh, this one did not. Did I do this wrong? Cheese log, extend. I'm going to go to my CSS file and just make sure I didn't.
You need an E on the end of cheese.
Ah, there we go. Sweet. Go back, refresh. Awesome. So second advantage, right? I'm going to do this, paste that, make sure you have
I
that
have a
set up.
feeling, Joe, I missed something because I feel like I heard it, but I must have fallen behind. There's
Okay.
the width, featured content width. I'm getting it's in my console that it's an error. It's an undefined variable.
Okay, have you put it here at the very top on line 7?
No, that's why. Okay.
Put it on line 7. Okay. So once again, just making it easier to write CSS. Sass is also you're going to see it if you're looking at job postings and they reference front-end developer. Sass is almost always going to be part of those requirements. There's another one called less, which I know Matt mentioned yesterday also. They're both preprocessors. Sass is the more predominant one. But if front end is really where you're going to go, you're going to have to kind of pick up Sass at some point in time. When we get to the end of this, I have an example of Sass. As I was doing some Flexbox research, I found a really cool Flexbox example where the person uses Angular and Sass. And it was, I think, was the thing that I had sent to you, Jeremy. I think your team, I had slacked it to you yesterday. Because it had the interval. You had mentioned doing interval to update things. And so it had that in Angular. Awesome. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Cool. Pretty close. So what do we got here? Almost there. Cool. I'm just going to make one small edit here. One tiny. Now that we've inherited it, we can add our own styles. We can add anything we want to beef log and cheese log. So here I'm going to say, for the beef log, I'm going to reference the Space Ghost red. And then for the cheese log, I'm going to reference for color the Space Ghost yellow. Right? I'm going to save it. I haven't taken a look at my Sass logs. Everything looks good. I go here. I update it. The colors have clearly changed. They're different colors. Okay. Get out of developer tools. So not only can we inherit, but we can define our own properties within you. Pretty useful feature. Now, the other big thing with Sass, so far we have the ability to create variables, which once again, maybe not so different than normal CSS. We have functions. You can create functions. We can nest things like we did with div here. It's nested. we can extend functionality, import things from other classes, and kind of inherit. Another advantage is using or importing some sort of partials or templating tools. So what we can do is kind of modularize our CSS, okay? And it helps, organize your code. I think one of the things mentioned as part of the demos, the project demos, was working in different CSS files. So you could have some sort of independence and no kind of crashing into each other or merge conflicts, right? Once you have that, you can then just copy and paste. Once everything works, you can organize them into one CSS file or have multiple CSS files. Sometimes a CSS file gets to be hundreds of lines long, and it's just easy to break it down into smaller CSS files and just import that functionality. So what we can do is we can leverage a concept called partials. And we know what partials are, right? Part of our final display. And there's libraries that allow us to do that. The two libraries that we're going to be doing or be installing is going to be Bourbon and Bitters. So I'm just going to take a look and see what are we installing. So I'm going to do Bitters, CSS, and so Bitters predefined styles for Bourbon, all right? So here it's just a scaffold, styles, variables, instructions for Bourbon. And Bourbon is another templating engine, right? So the two kind of go hand in hand, right? And it tells you what it's going to provide for us. Structures, they create variables, they have grid, settings, typography, you can create these lists. Maybe it'll fall into like the scope of Sing, and they're showing you like examples of what it does. Maybe like Bootstrap. Bootstrap does something very similar to this. If I import a table, I can have several versions of tables in Bootstrap, several versions of lists in Bootstrap. So that's Bourbon. That was Bitters, right? Bitters.bourbon. And then if we just go to Bourbon CSS, this is a lightweight Sass tool set. Okay, dependency-free. Bourbon is pure CSS. And so, they give you documentation on how to use Bourbon, what we're going to do with it. So there are two libraries that we can use. The order in which these have to be installed in that particular order. So we're going to install Bitters, install Bourbon, and then install Bitters here. And then we'll go through it. So let's do this. We go back in here. Now, for the moment, I'm just going to maybe stop, or here, I'm going to open up a new tab. So I'm in here. I'm going to go into the CSS folder, right? So now I'm in the CSS folder. Okay. Make sure you're in your CSS folder. And then we're just going to do the install. So gem, once again, we're using Ruby, install Bitters. Okay. Fetching Bitters, fetching Bourbon, fetching Bitters. Okay. And a gem, install Bourbon. Go install Bourbon. And I'm going to write Bitters install. Okay. And so what we should see here now in our CSS file is it created a folder called base, okay? So here's our base folder that it created, right? And what you'll see is things like, hey, buttons and layouts and tables and media and typography. If you go to typography, it's just gonna have some predefined settings for typography, for fonts, font styles, fonts weights, fonts colors, that type of thing, okay? We're also going to install Bourbon. Okay, Bourbon files installed. And we have a Bourbon folder. Once again, Bourbon has its own things, utilities, validators, settings, two separate tools for us to use. And then our folder structure should look like that. Okay, so I'm just going to put here installed Bitters and Bourbon. Okay. Let's see what it is. All right. So just give me a heads up, letting me know that you were able to install it.
Okay, so when we did the gem install bitters, that did it globally. Same with install bourbon globally, and then the bitters install and bourbon install is just going specifically into the CSS folder. Is that what
Yeah.
happened?
Mhm.
Okay.
It knows where you're at, so it's going to create it. So the bitters install. So installing the gem has the thing waiting there for us to use, right? So at any point in time, if we did bitters install, then it's going to create that folder structure for bitters wherever we make that call. And these are kind of things, you know, you're going to use bitters and bourbon across the scope of things. So sometimes it's nice just to be able to just reference them anywhere. We have our folder structure, right? Now we're going to start to see, all right, so we got 11, 12, 13. 13 so far. So I want everyone, we're going to have to create a few imports. So the imports are going to look similar to, or, you know, in construct to what we did in maybe Node, right? You can import things or require things. And in Sass, we're going to use the import kind of directive to do that. So I'm going to get out of this typography. I'm just staying here, right here, 15, 20. All right, awesome. So what at the very top of our Sass file, so I'm going to go to the very top, create some space there. What we are going to do is we're going to do a few imports. I'm going to say at import, and in double quotes, I'm going to say bourbon, bourbon / bourbon. Okay? Semicolon. I'm going to also import, we imported bourbon. I'm going to import the base also. There's that base folder that we saw. I'm going to also import, oh, we're not importing fonts just yet. So these are the only two we're going to import. Okay, so I got import bourbon, import base. Okay. Just going to see, did it change anything? Nope, doesn't look like anything's been changed as of yet. She knows, so it said should. What's that?
I think the buttons changed for add to cart.
Oh yeah, I was expecting larger changes here. So we have just the buttons being updated. Is that all we have? I'm just curious. I'm gonna comment these out. I just want to see if there's any other big change.
The font also changed.
Yeah, the font changed too, right? So I'm gonna go back here, add it. So we have these buttons and these fonts. I'm gonna save this, refresh it. Yeah, fonts changed a little bit. So it's applying some styling. It's like using it, I suppose, like a templating tool. I download some sort of portfolio template and it already has the predefined styles in it. Okay. So what we're going to do now also, so we've imported their specific settings, right? Now what we're going to do is we are going to create a new inside of our CSS, right? We're in our CSS folder right now. So I'm going to touch, and I'm going to create a file, but I'm going to put an underscore before it. I'm going to call it fonts.scss. Okay? ALS, I should see fonts SCSS. What we're going to wind up doing is I'm going to copy paste, and I'm going to select this out. A lot to type. And inside of our fonts CSS, right? Fonts, I'm going to paste it. I'm going to save it. So we can, if we wanted to, create specific or import specific fonts. I'm not sure if that's, you might have imported fonts using Google Fonts. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if Jerica, she probably walked you through importing Google Fonts. In this technique, sometimes fonts are files. I mean, ultimately, that's what they are, right? They're a file that contains certain settings. And so these are file types for fonts. OTF, WOOF is another file type. sometimes you might go to, when I was doing desktop support, I would go to people's machines. I was working for Time Inc., a media company, and they were very specific with their fonts. Somebody would get hired, they get a new Mac, and we'd have to get those fonts installed so that when they're, you know, building out an article, their fonts are aligned with what they're seeing, and then they know what to expect. So in this instance, we created a file that will import fonts. It creates fonts. So you can do this on your own. This could be done in normal CSS. We have add font face. You give it the font family name that you want to reference. That's your naming convention. The source is the source of that file or the font, and then the format of that font, okay? And so we have this imported here, right? The only thing is true type source, yeah. I'm gonna save it. Now, I'm going to go down to fonts. In our main CSS, right here, we're going to import those fonts. So I'm going to say add import fonts. Now, I didn't include the underscore. It kind of knows that it's an underscore. Almost like, you know, a node when you would import, you know, a controller's file. Did you need to put the .js? You didn't. You kind of knew it was a JS file. You just said, you know, user's controller, and boom, and it knew it was a JavaScript file. That's what you're importing. If it didn't have an extension, then it would have been that kind of import. So we're good. So we got 7, 8, and we did the import fonts. Just want to make sure. All right. Show everyone gets those imported. Don't type it out. Copy paste, it'll make it a lot easier. Okay. Now we just need to use those fonts, right? So in our body, just gonna copy this. In our body, our fonts, if I just took a look at the fonts again, just to see, in our fonts, we did have this After Sans, Chunk, and Spec. Those are the fonts. So in the body, I'm just gonna go and choose this After Sans, okay? And I'm gonna take a look. Did it change? I think it did change the fonts over here a little bit. We'll see it more when we get to beef log and cheese log. So we're gonna choose 2 fonts for those. Font family for the H1. So do we have an H1 here? We don't have an H1, right? So update the H1 font and center it. So under the body, so here's our body, right? We're going to create an H1 and create some space. And I'm just going to kind of take the settings here, paste it. Do this. Copy this. Let's knock that out. Okay, I'm going to save it. Our H1 should be space goes. Whoop, look, space goes. Change the font there. Okay. And then we want to go into our nested featured, add another element in H3. And in that H3, we can just add this font family of Chunk. There we go. I'm going to copy this. We'll select that out. If I save it, I go here, boom. They both have different fonts. I mean, they both have the same font. Once again, they're both H3s. Their fonts are different. And so it's easy to just do all these imports because in the end, that's, you know, if you have custom fonts, you have to import them. Or maybe we could have imported, you know, maybe use some of Bourbon's custom fonts to take a look at the Bourbon library. There's other tools outside of Bourbon you use as well. Only one more import that we're going to do. We're going to do finishing touches. Okay, finishing touches was a file that the other instructor had put together with a bunch of other styling here. I'm just going to import it. Go here, and the minute we refresh, you'll see lots of things change. So additional styling has changed, okay? They made some last-minute edits. If you take a look inside of Finishing Touches, you'll see. So here they're importing font face, right? So they added this. We could have added that to the fonts. In the end, I would probably aggregate all our fonts together, right? Let's see, do they have any nesting? So they have an example of nesting, P inside of cart, that's nested. Awesome. What else do they have? They have some animations here for the H1. It keeps going back and forth. One other thing that they have here too, that's another advantage to using Sass, are mix-ins. Now, what does this look like to you? If you had to say that that looked like something in JavaScript, what would that be? If I change the mix-in name to something else, another keyword, what would that look like to you?
A function?
Yeah, looks like a function, right? So a mix-in is essentially that, kind of like a function. Okay, I can call the float any place that I want. I pass in something, and it does these things for me. So this is what it looks like to me. Is it looks like it's an animation. Like it almost looks like this is a keyframe. That's what it looks like. It's a type of animation that you use with animation. When you call an animation, you actually call it by name, and then you define the animation. So here it looks like this is a mix-in that's doing something, and then here's the keyframe float and float button, and they're including float. Just like we included when we did the beef and the cheese log, it's including this, okay? Include float, and you give it a value. We pass in a value, and then that value will be referenced throughout, right? Kind of cool to be using functions and variables and inherit things inside of Sass. I always think of Sass as the JavaScript version, you know, or you're writing CSS as JavaScript-esque, okay? So, let me just let stand up. All right, so here we go. Hungry for more? If you want, you can take a look at everything. Once again, they kind of go into the explore mix-ins. You can take in the mix-ins, create your own Sass. Once again, they're kind of showing you the calculations. The only other thing I wanted to show you as it pertains to Sass as an example that, once again, I just kind of came across this example recently, and to show you the additional functionality that Sass has. So this is just a, I was looking into getting more material for teaching Flexbox across day classes, night classes, and I found this really cool one. And this was rotating through different Flex justify content values and like cycling through. And I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I like that. When I looked here, I saw in the HTML, I saw just divs, right? I didn't see the numbers, and then I had to ask myself, hey, where are those numbers coming from? I went down here to Angular because I thought maybe Angular was creating it. So the person had used Angular to do this, and I was looking, and I was like, I don't see anything here that references grabbing elements and putting numbers inside of them. This is more in regards to applying the different CSS values, the space, justify content, space between, space around, right? We can see that here. And it's using intervals. So this is kind of what I sent to Jeremy's group because they were talking about interval. And then I went to Sass here. I took a look. I saw SCSS. It's Sass. And the thing that I wanted to point out here is look at this for. This is essentially kind of a for loop. It loops over elements, loops over numbers from 1 to 11, and then grabs the nth of type of that number, nth of type 1, nth of type 2. It gives them heights. It gives them margins. It has some evaluations, like if the thing is less than the number 6, give it a dark color blue, give it a dark color green, change it. So with Sass, you can even extend it to do for loops and if else conditional logic. Once again, confirming that it's kind of like the JavaScript for Sass, for CSS. So it really is powerful. If you are moving in the direction of front end, this is something you want under your tool belt instead of always having to do JavaScript to like create elements or target elements. You can do the same thing in Sass. Okay, pretty powerful tool. Awesome. All right, that is all we have. Any questions on Sass? Curiosities?
Yeah, I actually had an issue where my imports aren't working on the CSS
Okay.
for some reason. Like everything else has been working so far. It's just the imports aren't coming through.
So these imports right here?
Yeah. Like none of it's coming through.
None of it's coming through. Okay. You want to share your screen?
Sure.
Oh, so let me stop sharing.
So like I have base and bourbon and the fonts, but none of it's coming through on the web page.
And you installed them in the order, right? There is. Okay. Because if at any point in time they weren't installed, like importing them as gems, you could do that independently. The import of the gem or the installing of the tool itself in general in the global scope won't matter, but if the install does matter.
Yeah, I don't think I had any issues with the install.
Okay. What I'm saying is that if we did the install, you'd have to have installed it like this. You'd have to install where we did it up here, right? Install bitters install. That has to be installed first. Then
so I did gem install bitters.
Gem install bourbon.
Gem install bourbon, and then bitters install and bourbon install. And it says installed the base and bourbon slash.
Okay. All right. Can you share your screen?
I am sharing, right?
Oh, I don't see it. I don't know where. Hold on 1 second.
Am I not sharing?
Yeah, I just don't see it. You can see it? Okay.
Let me try again.
No, you're seeing it. I just I minimized something and I can't seem to find where the other screens are at. Let me just take a quick look here. Where is my other screen? Like I had an open window or I put it behind something and I don't know where to put it. So let me just take a look. What do I do with it?
Installed, did you try to stop that watch thing, that CSS watch? Maybe you started.
Oh, that might be it.
Yeah. Oh, that's it too. Yeah. Okay. Good looking at.
Okay. What command was that?
I made some changes to my Zoom just before.
I think it's because I'm in CSS.
Yeah. Yeah, we need to make sure that in that file, we did the watch. If the watch is ever turned on.
It was when I was installing stuff, I stopped the watch.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's why I had gone into another folder. I opened up a new tab, had gone in here to do the install while it was maintaining the watch on the other one.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Awesome, cool.
So
Great.
Joe, is the watch what's actually compiling the Sass into the CSS then that needs to be running? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And when you get to something like React, it'll do the same thing. Like React, we can configure the compile tool to also like monitor Sass. So you don't have to type watch. It'll just do it on its own. Awesome. Okay. So let's I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lauren.
I have a question about the fonts. Where are they being imported from into the assets folder?
The fonts themselves, let me just take a look here. The fonts. So we're importing the fonts, right? You're talking about the underscore fonts file?
Right, like the import, we're going up into the assets folder.
Yes.
When you look at, like, where did that stuff come from and why does it look like gibberish if you open the files?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you look, you're not going to be able to understand that. Your machine is trying to process an OTF file, and Adam doesn't understand how that's processed. But your machine does know how to look at that and then process that into something that makes sense. We can't.
Right, but where does that come from? Is there like a website that has like official fonts?
Oh, yeah, you can go to sites that have those fonts. So if you look at like custom fonts, OTF or WOOF files, you'll find tons of files like that out there that you have to download and then kind of import into your project. With the use of like Adobe fonts and Google fonts that you can just reference as URLs, I would suppose like the need to download these fonts is getting less and less a necessity versus just referencing them online.
Okay, so it's just a different way of doing it.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, in some way, shape, or form, Google Fonts is doing the same thing. Like the font has to be in some sort of file to reference. And that URL is just sending back the content of what would be this OTF or whatnot. Sweet. All right, so let's do this. Let us go on break. 11:16. Why don't we come back at 11:26? Take a 10-minute break. Go back. Come back at 11:26. All right. Yeah,